Israel has started their ground invasion. I should say their ground invasion is now extending to the south of Gaza. You'll recall there are at least 1 million internal refugees in Gaza. This is an area basically the size of twice the size of Manhattan. 1 million people moving from one of those areas to the other, and now they're attacking that second area. And
they're the lucky ones, we should say. Like, I mean, those are the folks that thus far has survived, as the death toll increases to 16,000 that we know of in Gaza.
Yeah, I think easily a minimum of 16,000 at this point. But some figure, they haven't even been able to quite figure it out at this point. 60% of the country is probably now without housing because it's been destroyed. There are food shortages. There are water shortages. There is aid that's coming in, but yet there's, you cannot replace an entire infrastructure with trucks.
26 of Gaza's 35 hospitals are no longer in service.
At all. No service whatsoever. Here is let's start with this one. This is, let's just talk about the way this is being waged. Former State Department official Josh Paul was on Christine Amanpour's show yesterday. And you recall that yesterday we played a clip from Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, basically saying there were moral issues with what Israel is doing in terms of the Gazan civilian population.
He's like, you're not going to Colin Powell me or whatever.
On some level, I really do think that like it is surprising.
Yep.
And he's basically saying that the Israelis are headed for strategic defeat. So aside from the moral reprehensibility of what they're doing, this is not something they're going to win long term. And here is Josh Paul, who resigned from the State Department, and let's hear what he had to say with Amanpour.
I was struck by what the U.S. Defense Secretary said. I mean, this is a very bold military assessment that this amount of civilian killing is going to lead not only to this tragedy that the world is witnessing, but a strategic, he used the word defeat.
Yes.
And so tell me, how do you assess what he said?
I think he's right. And I think what you see is a tension between those of us who have worked in political and military fields on the ground in the Middle East and in the defense establishment, in the uniformed services, who understand that this is not going to work. This is not going to lead to the result that Israel wants. It is just going to prolong the suffering of both the Israeli and the Palestinian people for another generation. As opposed to, I think, a very political, ideological perspective that is coming from the political level in the US and in Israel and in the UK, that thinks that there is a way to make this work. There is not, and the suffering we are seeing on the ground really reflects that. I can't recall a time in my experience where I've seen such a disconnect between our values and our actions, or between the perspectives of our political leadership and the realities on the ground.
Can I ask you where and how you draw that line and make that difference? This is not the first time Israel has gone to war against Hamas in Gaza, and it's not the first time there has been backlash around the world. What makes you say that this is so different to have caused you to have resigned?
So a number of factors, the first of which is just the scope and the scale. You know, here we are 2 months into this conflict, and we have seen 3 times more children die, 6,000 in Gaza, than in 2 years of Russia's war against Ukraine. We have seen over 50 journalists killed, over 100 UN aid workers, over 200 medical professionals. You know, do you know what it takes to be a doctor in Gaza?
We've interviewed a lot of them, and it's a terrible situation for
The
them.
scale of the loss has been astounding. And of course, my role in the State Department involves approving many of these major arms transfers that are going to Israel right now that are enabling this killing.
But this is American policy. It's not like these are rogue transfers. This is American policy, bipartisan, decades long. Israel is America's strongest ally in the Middle East, and America provides the most aid in the world to Israel, and obviously to Egypt as well, but in general to Israel. Again, what is so unscrutinized about this? What was so different that made you resign publicly?
Well, in all the arms transfers I've been a part of discussing before, including to Israel, there has always been space for discussion and debate. You can raise concerns about how are these arms going to be used. Do we have confidence that laws of war, laws of proportionality are going to be respected? Do we have concerns about some of the units that these arms might be going to and their track records? What was different here was that there was no discussion. There was no space for that discussion. There was simply an approach of essentially the barn doors are open, and that remains the case. The Wall Street Journal reported just in the last couple of days that America has transferred over 4,000 dumb bombs to Israel, several thousand guidance kits, and 45,000 artillery shells. So the barn doors remain open, and while I'm certainly encouraged to hear what Vice President Harris said, what Secretary Austin has said, for as long as those barn doors remain open, I don't know why Israel would take those warnings seriously.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the bottom line. You've got a guy who subscribes to U.S. policy, obviously, just says that the mechanisms have been essentially completely disregarded. The idea of even assessing what Israel has done has been thrown out the window. And he's begging, it sounds like, members of Congress to condition this aid so that they can impose those assessments.
He mentioned there, too, though, that even without the aid package going through Congress, the Biden administration has already been transferring weapons to Israel under, like, the powers of the executive that I would say are dubious, but have been consistently done for the past few decades, ramped up. I mean, I guess it's the AUMF, right, that allows him to do this?
I don't even know, to be honest, on what authority they do that. I mean, there's theoretically some type of backlog with the $3 billion. Very rarely is it a situation where they just transfer, here's a check for $3 billion. It is, you now have an account at this arms manufacturer and this arms manufacturer, and they'll send you this amount of things and those amount of things. I can't help but imagine that there is within the Pentagon budget sort of a slush fund for some of these things, and that part of this, $14 billion that they're looking for Israel will go back to replenish stuff that they have already sort of like advanced to Israel. But Bernie Sanders has come out and basically said, I'm okay with the first 4, which apparently he perceives as being purely defensive in terms of like the Iron Dome. The next 10 billion should be conditioned. It's unlikely that he's going to be joined by many votes against what the Senate is planning to vote on tomorrow in terms of the supplemental. That'll also include Ukraine aid. I think $60 billion for Ukraine aid, and then maybe some money for the wall as a way of getting that through, and then some domestic spending, not too much. But this is, this is pretty damning, and it definitely feels like there is a part of the state and defense apparatus within the U.S. government that is at least attempting to push back on this. Ben from Ohio says it's only a strategic loss for Israel if you accept that its goal is to actually eradicate Hamas, which we know it isn't. Israel actually depends on continued future blowback to continue their ethnic cleansing project. And I think the idea that this is about eradicating Hamas and any type of long-term solution is completely blinkered.
Yeah.
I mean, first and foremost, it is about Bibi Netanyahu staying in power and staying out of jail. I think you mentioned right before the show, right? That
basically Netanyahu has been trying to delay the corruption trial proceedings and the inquiry into that for years at this point. He used COVID as an excuse before. And then just now, I read on Al Jazeera that his lawyer has successfully petitioned to get the hearings on that down from 3 a week to 2 because of how preoccupied Netanyahu is with, the war crimes in Gaza. I had seen an excerpt of this interview. This is a bit of an audible, but I just wanted to go to it. It's maybe at minute 8, if we could go to it, where he addresses the accusation from a Palestinian boy where he said that he was raped in an Israeli prison. He was 13 years old, and he calls that accusation credible. Just because, I think that that's important to play because we're talking about sexual violence, and right now the House is prepping a bit, or maybe it's the Senate, I forget.
House resolution
prepping a bill condemning Hamas's sexual violence against Israelis. This is a former State Department official saying that accusations from Palestinians on that front are credible. It's okay. I sprung this.
Arms transfers and talking about the inhumanity that's happening in Gaza that's rising to an intolerable level.
I think what happened on October 7th was an absolute atrocity, was 1,000 atrocities. I think at the same time we condemn those atrocities, we have to condemn the atrocities that happen every day to Palestinians in the West Bank. You mentioned sexual violence. I was part of the human rights vetting process for arms going to Israel, and a charity called Defense of Children International Palestine drew our attention at the State Department to the sexual assault, actually the rape of a 13-year-old boy that occurred in an Israeli prison in the Mosque Bia in Jerusalem. We examined these allegations. We believe they were credible. We put them to the government of Israel. And you know what happened the next day? The IDF went into the DCIP offices and removed all their computers and declared them a terrorist entity. I think it is vital that atrocities not happen to anyone, not sexual violations, not any kind of gross violation of human rights. We are looking at a situation where there is so much dehumanification, where people are not seen for the value that they have. And I think that's true whether you're talking about those who are attacked on their kibbutz or those who are attacked in their homes in Gaza or in the West Bank. What we really need is to center the human beings who are at the core and who are suffering so much in this conflict.
So that's also notable there, right? I mean, that is him directly in his role at the State Department. That is going to be as sympathetic to Israel as possible, recounting the story of basically not an NGO, but some sort of group that had been speaking out about sexual violence against Palestinians in Israeli prisons, and that the Israeli government designated them a terrorist organization. It's just notable here because of the incredible hypocrisy about this renewed focus on this issue.
Or the failure of addressing both sides of it.
Yes, exactly. And when Amanpour keeps asking him over and over again, why now? Why now? I don't understand what's unclear about it, because we have 16,000 people that have been killed by Israel in 2 months.
Well, and I think I think the point ultimately is that at one point, do you make an assessment and say whatever has been going on for decades has not been working? Mm-hmm. It has not brought about peace. The theory that Israel has been operating on, I think many people understood what it was prior to now, but you can't, as a country, have it both ways. You cannot say that the point of the way that we're going about this as a ethno-nationalist project is presumably to keep Jews safe from around the world, and then also say we're not safe 75 years out.
Yep.
And something's not working. And I think that is what has happened. I mean, we're on the brink of a so-called peace deal that completely ignored the existence of millions of people who are left without any form of representation, without any sovereignty, dispossessed of their land, an inability to control their economies, an inability to control even their basic services. You can't start a water treatment plant in the West Bank or in Gaza unless Israel says you can. Their electricity is subject to Israel turning it off because they were not given the opportunity to create their own power stations.
Which they did quite frequently, and there would only be hours at a time that electricity would be available to Palestinians even before this.
You have seen them, the Israelis, blow up their major educational institutions. I mean, like on and on.
They
And
bombed their only COVID testing center in the height of the pandemic.
So,
I mean, what else is it? So it's becoming clear to people, I would say. But the speed at which these realizations are happening, I mean, it's a glacial pace, and there's hundreds of people are going to die every day as people start to begin to wake up to the fact that they have bought into a dehumanization of an entire population for decades, despite, seemingly engaging with these issues on a daily basis. I'm talking about the media, but also many people in government as well.